Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on this call. I'm David Cicilline. I represent the 1st Congressional District of Rhode Island. We have lots of wonderful colleagues on the phone today, and so I'm going to just make a few brief remarks and ask each of my colleagues to speak for about 2 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. I want to thank Congresswoman Grace Meng from New York, who's co-hosting this call, for her extraordinary leadership. Brian Higgins from the great state of New York also, who's been really leading the call for more research into prevention and treatment in response to COVID-19. We're also joined by Donald Payne from the great state of New Jersey, who's been working very hard to expand testing in New Jersey. And Dwight Evans from the great state of Pennsylvania, actually a Commonwealth, I think, if I'm not mistaken, who has been a really strong and very early voice for implementing the Defense Production Act to produce necessary testing supplies. So I'm really delighted that such a distinguished group of colleagues have joined us for this regional call. I think we're mostly here to really sound the alarm of how urgent it is that we act, that the Senate act on the HEROES Act. You know, the Senate is in session this week to confirm more right-wing judges rather than taking up the HEROES Act. And we are really here to urge Senator McConnell to take up the HEROES Act instead. The HEROES Act for my state would provide $5.3 billion to Rhode Island and, of course, protect the lives and livelihoods of New Englanders. It honors our heroes, providing almost $1 trillion to state, local, territorial, and tribal governments who need funds for first responders and healthcare workers who are risking their lives to keep us safe during this pandemic and are at risk of losing their jobs. It establishes a Heroes Fund for essential workers with $200 billion to ensure that essential workers who are risking their lives during this pandemic receive hazard pay. It supports testing, tracing, and isolation with $75 billion to ensure every American has access to free coronavirus treatment. And it provides additional direct payments to families, cash payments to help cushion the blow of the coronavirus epidemic with a second round of stimulus checks. Again, $1,200 per family member, up to a maximum of $6,000 per household. It also includes availability to the PPP program to local newspaper, radio, and TV businesses as small businesses. I think an important reform of the PPP. So those are just some of the highlights. And with that, I'd like to now turn it over to Grace Meng for some opening comments.
Thank you to our chairman, David Cicilline, for convening all of us here today and for your tremendous leadership throughout the year, and especially during this crisis. It's always good to be in the presence of my colleagues, Rep. Brian Higgins, Dwight Evans, Donald Payne. And thank you for your work as well. As you all know, this is truly an unprecedented time in our nation, and it requires an unprecedented response by Congress. And we were really happy that we were able to pass the HEROES Act last Friday, which is containing measures that is truly needed for the American people. The bill we approved really puts our workers, frontline workers, our heroes at the forefront. As many of you know, I represent parts of Queens, New York, including Elmhurst Hospital, which many of you have seen in images on TV in the early weeks of this pandemic in the United States. I have seen firsthand so much of the suffering and the pain that the virus has caused, and how many of my constituents were hurting and still continue to need help. People are scared, they're uncertain about their future, and they desperately need all the help that they can get. And while the CARES Act and the previous act were very comprehensive pieces of legislation, we would still hear from many constituents that needed additional help. And the HEROES Act provides so much of that help. And Chairman Cicilline mentioned some of them, but I'll highlight some of the ones that are especially relevant to my district and New Yorkers, but probably to many other areas as well. The $200 billion fund to help fund a hazard pay for frontline workers, and it has a very broad category of essential workers. who have literally, as we saw after on 9/11, when our first responders rushed into the towers of the burning buildings, we have here our essential workers rushing to hospitals and to their workplaces so that they could take care of so many people, upwards of the 20,000 who have died here in New York. We allowed in this program an expansion of the SNAP program to allow workers to allow people to buy hot foods, for example. That's something that has been done in various places during crises and catastrophes like this. And it also increases funding for SNAP benefits also. Something that I was hearing constantly about was that previous cash stimulus payments only allowed holders of Social Security numbers to benefit from it. But even if you were married to someone who didn't have a social number but had an ITIN, you could not even benefit from this as well. Extending work permits for immigrants, many of whom are continuously serving as essential workers and are on the front lines of combating this coronavirus. And then something I worked on very closely with Mr. Jim Clyburn was about $1.5 billion for internet access for students. 12 million students across the country have no access to the internet and are unable to do their homework right now. So those are some of the highlights of this HEROES Act. There are many other vital provisions. People in my district have come up to me from conservative to more liberal, and many of them like many provisions of the HEROES Act and want to see the Senate pass it as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Meng, and I'll turn it over to Congressman Higgins.
Grace, Don, and Dwight, great to see you. And David Cicilline, thank you for your continued leadership in developing the House majority message as it relates to this and so many other issues. 70,000 Americans are dead. 1,500 will die today. And the delay in dithering has already cost tens of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. The fact of the matter is, we spend $700 billion a year on defense, and we cannot marshal the federal resources to make sure that nurses on the front line have face masks. We are the lead country in the entire world as it relates to medical research, and we don't have a treatment for this. The best thing our fragile healthcare system can do is provide support services for those who are afflicted with this disease. We should have been ready because this has been around now for 2 decades. This is the 3rd outbreak of the coronavirus. The first was SARS back in 2002, 2003. We should have been investing into the National Institutes of Health to develop an effective vaccine or treatment that would have been prepared over a 2-decade period. Now we're rushing to try to develop a treatment and a vaccine that won't be ready for many, many years. Don't believe what you're hearing about this aggressive schedule within the next couple of months. The fact of the matter is, a week ago tomorrow, the House took decisive action in approving a $3 trillion disaster relief bill, 1/3 of which was to help states and localities that were kicked out of the last bill because of one individual, Mitch McConnell. According to the State University of New York at Albany, the Rockefeller Institute, state of Kentucky took $45 billion from the federal government last year. The state of New York, my state, Grace's state, gave the federal government $21 billion. Had it not been for the federal government, Mr. McConnell's impoverished state would be bankrupt. And he suggests bankruptcy as a solution to the state of New York that has experienced 25% of COVID-19 cases as his response, the national leader. The word pandemic is derived from the Latin word pandemos, which means all of us, all the people. And a national response in a time of national emergency requires strong, decisive national leadership that we are not getting. And it requires a strong, decisive disaster relief to help all aspects of the American economy, both public and private. So I'm glad to be with you all today. Thank you all for your leadership, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the program here.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Payne, Congressman Payne from New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline. It's a real honor and a privilege to be on with you today, and my colleagues, Grace, Mr. Higgins, and Mr. Evans, three members that have really made a difference for their districts on the floor of Congress. I'm able to watch them operate every single day, and they're very fortunate to have the members of Congress those districts have. And I'd just like to say good morning. And we're here for a very serious reason, obviously. This coronavirus has created a public health and economic crisis like we've never seen. This is why we have to support these aid packages that we have put forth. The latest one, the HEROES Act, is a $3 trillion coronavirus aid package to help the Americans, state and local governments, and small businesses during this global pandemic. You know, I'm really proud that it contained $200 billion to give hazard pay to our essential workers. It has been a thing that I've supported, been a strong supporter of for additional pay for workers on the front lines of our COVID battle. Because going into the grocery stores as I did, and knowing the first responders working in our hospitals, it bothered me that they were not being compensated for being on the front lines. And it's a twofold issue. A lot of the people that are still working have no choice but to work, and also are in essential positions. So it's our lower paid janitors, people in grocery stores, mom and pop shops on the corner, bodegas, that have stayed open to keep this country fed and healthy. So why shouldn't they be compensated? I wrote a bill to get hazard pay for federal workers, before this HEROES Act passed. So, I'm proud my Democratic colleagues recognize the importance of essential workers with the action that did not surprise me. These workers will get an extra $13 per hour if the bill is passed. That could make a big difference in a lot of people's lives. These are grocery store clerks, bus drivers, and child daycare workers who are on the job daily, and they need to be rewarded for that. This is just one of the examples of how this bill supports those who have supported us through this crisis. It includes money to help the post office. It provides one of the oldest services of our federal government, one that is usually a point of pride for all Americans. And the bill includes $875 billion to help our state and local governments. There's been a huge cry from my cities and towns since the second package that they were concerned where they were going to end up with respect to their budgets. And the HEROES Act answers the call. It is giving real dollars to every town and hamlet in this country for this pandemic. Like our essential workers, state and local governments deal with the fallout from this global pandemic directly. They pay our first responders and unemployment benefits, which are skyrocketing right now. So I voted for the bill because it is a good bill for all of us. It is a good for American families, American workers, and American business. And with that, I thank you, and I will yield back, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. And our final speaker before we go to questions is Congressman Dwight Evans.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And Grace and Brian and Don, it's absolutely my pleasure to be a part of that. But I want to say something especially about David as chairman. I describe him as the canary in the mine. He is alerting all of us that we have a real situation here. We're trying to safeguard our democracy, which by providing resources for elections. That is something that we should not take lightly. That democracy is important to all of us. And this is our democracy. And one of the key elements that is so much a part of the HEROES initiative is the initiative around election security. The need that we must take care and guard our election in this process. In Pennsylvania, we'll get $100 billion as we pass, if we pass this particular bill. And we understand how sacred that vote is. We should not ever take that vote for granted. And David recognizes that. So that's why he is organizing this effort by all of us coming together to raise the consciousness to everyone that we should guard that right to vote. We should not take that for lightly. The census, this is the 10th year, it's written in the Constitution. We must also make sure the accuracy on the census. The census is also something that is extremely important. And as Don just described, the post office service. That post office service is something that, again, for years has set the tone. So I conclude with all of this, with all of my colleagues, with all of that expressing what is in the HEROES Act is something about all of us looking out for the people. We recognize the importance, and that's why we stand there. So I pass back to David.
Thanks so much, Fred, and thank you for your nice words. Rich, we're ready to start the Q&A.
If you have a question, click the raise hand button and we will take as many questions as we can. If you are asking a question, please remember to unmute your line and let us know which member your question is directed to so we can get to as many questions as possible. And I'll just give members of the press a couple moments if they'd like to ask a question. Mr. Chairman, there are no questions in the queue.
Great. We have over, I think, 7 members of the press, so that's good. We answered all their questions. If there are none, we'll let Grace Meng close us. But thank you again to all my colleagues for being part of this.
Thank you again to Chairman Cicilline, and it's great to be with my colleagues. And I know we went over certain parts and certain highlights of the HEROES Act, and I just want to re-emphasize how crucial it is for so many Americans across the country in all of our districts, Republicans, Democrats, urban, suburban, rural areas, to pass this legislation. This provides much additional needed help for the American people. If we want to start thinking about reopening this country and the economy, we need to make sure that we are providing money for our heroes, our frontline workers, our most essential workers, and making sure that we are putting money into the pockets of our fellow Americans. As Speaker Pelosi has said before, there will be no more cost-effective time or moment to make these investments. As we make sure that we are doing everything we can to reopen our economy and to get the American people back on their feet, we must make sure that the HEROES Act is signed into law. And obviously we need Mitch McConnell to act as soon as possible. Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, and it's great to be with all of you.
Thank
And
you.
if
And
I
I think
could
we
just-
have one question.
We do have one question from Scott Wong of The Hill.
Hi, guys. Thanks for taking my call. We saw some polls yesterday showing that anti-China sentiment is rising among Americans. Maybe Ms. Meng or Mr. Cicilline could address this. I'm just wondering if, we've seen the Republicans attack Democrats, and particularly some of your more vulnerable colleagues, maybe not yourselves, but some of your frontline members on the China issue, painting Democrats as soft on China. And I'm just wondering, how concerned are you that these attacks, particularly given the polling we've seen on China, how concerned are you about some of these frontline members?
Well, I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Grace since you referenced Grace. But look, I think it's very clear that the President of the United States is attempting to assign blame and responsibility for his own failed leadership. There's no question that there are real issues about China's transparency, particularly at a time that the President was praising China for their transparency. So there are real issues there, but the reality is the President of the United States is responsible for the federal response, and the President from the very early days of this pandemic attempted to minimize the seriousness of it, suggested to the American people, told the American people it would go away miraculously on its own, that it would, once the warm weather came, it would just disappear, that it was nothing more than a hoax by the Democrats intending to undermine his leadership and his presidency. He squandered 6 or more weeks of valuable time that he should have been preparing. He disbanded the division within the National Security Council responsible for managing a global pandemic. So look, the President of the United States is not responsible for the coronavirus, but he is responsible for his response to the coronavirus. And I think he failed the American people, and I think he is attempting to distract from his own failures, from his refusal to invoke the Defense Production Act in a meaningful way, to massively produce what we need, to get testing out. So I think this is part of a pattern which the President is trying to assign responsibility to somebody, some organization, some person, some country to really distract from his own failures. So look, Democrats have been very robust in our criticism of the early stages of this pandemic and a lack of transparency by the World Health Organization and by the Chinese government. But that doesn't take away from the really failed leadership of this president, who I think has contributed significantly to the number of deaths we've seen in this country as a result of just utter incompetence. So with that, I turn over to Congresswoman Meng.
Sure. I know that our country and Congress should have conversations about China and the coronavirus. I think the facts will speak to themselves as to the Trump family's relationship to China and how they've benefited. But let's be clear, from President Trump to Senator Cotton to our Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, they have continued to use racism to disguise their lack of responsiveness to this virus and their lack of responsibility. This president can't tell the difference between the China government and people from China and patriotic Chinese Americans that are his constituents as well. So we ask him to stop covering the lack of responsiveness with racism.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to say something? Any of my other colleagues? Nope. Great. Well, thank you again for being part of this regional press call, and thank you to the press for joining us, and everyone stay safe.